Measuring the economy. Is GDP obsolete? Diane Coyle is the Bennett Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge and author of GDP, A Brief but Affectionate History. Hello, Dame Diane.
Hello, nice to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining me today. So, give me a quick definition. What is GDP, gross domestic product?
It's a measure of the whole of the economy.
Mhm.
And anybody who's done undergrad economics will know the formula. It's C plus I plus G plus X minus N. So consumption, investment, government spending, and exports net of imports.
Mhm.
And so that's very familiar. But it's not really a real entity. It isn't something that exists in the world. It's an idea. It was defined in the 1940s during the Second World War and was tailored around the demand management theories of John Maynard Keynes. So that's how it came to be.
Mhm.
There have always been problems with it. People have never been totally satisfied. For example, it doesn't include unpaid care in the home, which is obviously economically valuable and competes with marketed services. That's one instance. It doesn't include all of the benefits that we get from nature, and so people overuse some natural resources. A lot of them are in the market, but many are not. So all those have been known. And the history of GDP is recounted in that book, GDP, A Brief but Affectionate History. What I've gone on to write since is a book called The Measure of Progress, just out, which is about what's missing now, what's new, why is GDP so much less appropriate now than it was even 20 years ago.
Okay, well, that's exactly what I want to talk to you about today. So let's get right into that. For one thing, have there indeed been attempts to modify, replace, or supplement GDP prior to this over the years?
There have been attempts to come up with not so much a single replacement, although some people have tried to construct an index that takes account of things like the natural environment. Um, but dashboards have become very popular. So the idea that you can't capture all of the information that you would want about the economy in one number, and therefore you have a collection of things on a dashboard that will show you, what's happening to housing, what's happening to incomes, maybe
I
what's
see.
happening to trade separately, what's happening to the distribution of income. So whatever people think is important, they can put in the dashboard. The
Hmm.
trouble is, they're a bit ad hoc and they vary a lot. And so there's been no agreement about what you might want to put in those. And anyway, having one number that tells you I think it's getting better or worse is just quite compelling.
It seems so. Yeah, definitely. It's so easy to be able to define it in that way. Uh, has GDP over the years, have there been attempts to politically manipulate it, to redefine it in ways that reflect more favorably on administration that happens to be in power or less favorably on opposition administrations?
Not so much GDP itself. It's defined by a United Nations process. Most of the work is done by statisticians. Most of them are in independent agencies.
Hmm.
So the definitions are pretty uniform and not really easy to manipulate. The political argument has always been about if you want to adjust for inflation, what price index do you use? And that's a much more complicated question. And that's an area where people think there has been political manipulation. For example, because social security payments or bond payments might be linked to a particular price index. So if you change the way that's constructed, that looks like it's taking money away from people who thought they were due it.
Hmm.
Now, I think the statisticians themselves are not really very political. They are typical technocrats. They want to do the right thing. But there have been debates, in particular about inflation and what that implies for the cost of living over time.
Hmm. So, in fact, GDP in the past has been used as a guide for monetary policy by central banks and the like.
Yes, and I think that there will always be a need for a measure of that kind. So if you're
Hmm.
doing macroeconomic policy, you want to know how much is the government net injecting into the economy through tax and spend, or what's monetary policy doing. You need that sort of total measure, probably nominal GDP, so not adjusted for inflation, and we'll always need that.
Hmm.
But the argument I would make is that because of technology, because of globalization, and the shifts that are happening now, of course, with tariffs, and is there a retreat from offshoring? Um, that means that the kind of measures that go into constructing GDP have missed a huge amount of change that's gone on in the economy with digital technologies and with changes in the structure of production around the world.
Okay, so again, you refer to it, you refer to your attitude toward it as affectionate in the title to your book, which I guess means you're maybe not talking about discarding GDP entirely, but what is your proposal for either replacing, complementing, augmenting to provide us with a more accurate tool for measuring the economy?
Well, two or three things we could do. First of all, we could collect a lot more data about what is going on in the digital economy and indeed about supply chains. So we're often taken by surprise by bottlenecks in supply chains caused by some political row or some natural disaster like a flood. So we don't have a very good data set that tells us about those supply chains. But equally, things like cloud computing. How much data is being transferred? Where is it being stored? How much are companies paying for cloud computing services? Or something like the what's called factoryless goods production, very relevant now. So companies like Apple or Nike don't actually manufacture, they design, and that's the high value part of the activity. So understanding better all of the companies that do that, and it's much more widespread than those headline cases that we all know about.
Hmm.
It might be companies that one thinks of as manufacturers but are selling a lot of digital services. And an example in my recent book is Rolls-Royce, which manufactures amazingly sophisticated aircraft engines, but most of its revenues and profits come from the services it sells, monitoring those digitally and enabling airlines to maintain things on time, to fix problems early, save a lot of downtime, and save costs. So there are all kinds of structural changes that have gone on. We need better data on that.
It
But
seems
the
that
other thing,
go on. I'm sorry. Please continue.
well, I was going to say the other thing I advocate for is a balance sheet for the economy. GDP is like a profit and loss account. It tells you what's happening in a certain period of time, but you'd never look at a company just in terms of its profit and loss. You'd look at its balance sheet as well to understand its broad sustainability over time. And I would argue we should do that for the economy. We don't think much about the assets on which businesses and individuals can draw to continue making progress and having their living standard get better over time.
Mm. Surprised at how much is missed in GDP these days in a so-called digital economy. Have there not been some controversies over what to include that is already included, such as government expenditures? That's part of GDP now, is that correct?
It is, and that was a decision taken during the Second World War because the US and UK, who were devising these definitions, did not want to show that the war effort, which was government spending, was reducing living standards. So the decision was made to include it in GDP.
Hmm.
If you're thinking about monetary policy, then that's money in the economy and you want to know about it. So there's a good reason to have it there.
Hmm.
But equally, there are things the government does that are what's sometimes regrettables. So, for example, if you've got to pay more for police because of a crime wave, then that's not adding to people's welfare. So there was
Yeah,
a vigorous debate at the time about whether or not to include GDP. Now, taking it out is a different story, and maybe that some people think that's a good idea because it will show just private sector growth, and that's more meaningful in some way. But equally, if all the other countries in the world are leaving their GDP definition unchanged and you take yours out, you make yourself look much poorer by comparison to other
sure.
countries.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're proposing, it seems, the addition of many more data points and much more information that's not part of GDP today. On the other hand, there is some talk here, especially among the members of the Trump administration, for actually in cutting federal expenditures and cutting federal programs, perhaps even not reporting as much as we report now, and in fact not being as revealing about just what the numbers actually are. That's going in the other direction. Are we seeing a danger there in terms of suppressing these numbers to the point where we, the public, won't actually know the true value of the economy?
Well, I think that would be really unhelpful. And apart from the
Hmm.
obvious reason that citizens ought to have some visibility over what their government's policies are doing to the economy, we're in a world where every private company understands that data is valuable. And that means that data is valuable to the public as well. And so these statistics produced by the official agencies are of use to businesses who want to do market forecasting.
Hmm.
And if we're praising private sector companies for investing in their own data, we should be thinking about governments investing in data as well and making that available as part of the economic infrastructure of the nation. And if you take that away from people, they're going to be steering blind, as it were. So I
Yeah.
think that's really unhelpful. I would say that there could be more thought given to more efficient ways of doing it. A lot of it's still done by old-fashioned surveys that go to companies and individuals. The response rates to the surveys are declining. So it's time to come up with some innovation in how the statistics are put together. But I
Hmm.
would advocate strongly for sustaining and actually investing more in them.
Here again, if you want the GDP to reflect a digital economy, the GDP calculation itself probably should be more digital then, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Interesting. So, do you see an actual political or social appetite out there for making these changes that you're proposing?
There's certainly a lot of interest in understanding better what's happening on the production side of the economy. And that's because in pretty much all the advanced economies, productivity growth has slowed down considerably. Economists don't have a simple answer for why that's happened. Part of the reason might be that we're not measuring well what's going on,
Hmm.
or at least not understanding the way that companies have reorganized production and are using these new digital tools over time. So there's interest in that community. There's a lot of interest around the world, particularly at state level or local level, or the equivalents in other countries, at having a broader measure of how people are getting on. And GDP itself is not thought to be a good signal of is there economic progress or not. So there's a
Hmm.
lot of interest in things like what's the health of the community. A lot of communities have been devastated by opioids or by the pandemic and not recovering from that. And that feeds directly into their job prospects, their earnings, and the economy as a whole. So a lot of communities are now interested in measuring health in different ways, or access to broadband, access to other kinds of infrastructure. So there's definitely an appetite for a more holistic approach to
Hmm.
understanding whether or not the community is progressing.
But as you yourself point out, there's a need for global consistency of economic measurement. If we say here in the United States, or you there in the UK, adopt our own new way of measuring the economy and the rest of the world does not, then you have sort of an apples and oranges thing, and it's difficult to assess just how we stand vis-a-vis other countries. Is that not an issue?
It is an issue. You're right. It's really compelling for countries to compare themselves to each other. But that's why I advocate for this balance sheet approach, because the headings would be consistent across countries.
Hmm.
The elements might be different, but each country would have a heading for its physical infrastructure, for its private productive capital, for its intangible capital that's so important for business now, for its human capital, and so on. And so there would be that kind of comparability across countries. And I don't think we're ever going to do away with GDP, even as it gets modified over time. So
Hmm.
those rankings that we're all familiar with will still be there.
Dame Diane Coyle at the University of Cambridge. I want to thank you so much for joining me for this discussion of GDP, gross domestic product, and how we might change it in such a way as to more accurately reflect the economy of our respective countries in the world. Thank you so much for being with me today.
It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.